Here's a quiet reason successful people still feel like failures. Almost nobody talks about it. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a workshop at midnight, when the only two things still awake are the dust motes drifting in lamplight and a woman who has measured the same board 9 times and still does not trust her own hands. She runs her thumb along the edge, searching for a flaw that may or may not be there. And underneath the searching waits a quieter fear, one she has never once said out loud, that it might never be enough, no matter how many times she measures. Her name is Elena, and by almost any honest account, she had built something worth being proud of. 12 years ago, she started in a borrowed garage with a second-hand saw and a stack of wood she couldn't really afford. Tonight, she owns the workshop around her, full of waiting orders, good light, and the clean smell of sawdust and oil. People who knew her back then would call this success. Elena called it Tuesday. This is a story about that strange, quiet distance, the gap between what a person has actually built and what they allow themselves to feel about it. It happens to trace the same idea explored in a book called The Gap and the Gain, written by Dan Sullivan and Dr. Benjamin Hardy, though Elena had never read it and wouldn't have had a name for what was happening to her even if she had. She only knew the feeling. You may know it too, even if you've never given it a name. By the time this story ends, you will understand exactly why that feeling exists and exactly what it's been quietly costing you. She set the board down at last and looked toward the front window, where the early light was just starting to gray the dark. In 6 weeks, the Great Hall across town would host the Centennial Exhibition, the kind of show that happens once in a craftsman's life, if it happens at all. 12 makers would be chosen out of hundreds who applied. One name sat on the judging panel that made Elena's stomach tighten every time she let herself think about it. Anton Voss. She had grown up turning the pages of Voss's old catalogs, the way other children memorize maps of countries they hope to visit one day. His furniture didn't just hold objects. It seemed to hold time itself. Every joint so exact it looked less built than grown, as though the tree had simply decided, on its own, to become a chair. If Anton Voss looked at one of her pieces and nodded, even once, Elena had quietly decided long ago she would finally know she had arrived. Not before, never before. It was a private arithmetic she'd been running since she was 16, although she would never have used a word like arithmetic for it. Once I have my own bench, she told herself, sweeping someone else's floor in someone else's shop, I'll know I'm a real craftsman. Then it was once I have my own workshop. Then once I have 10 clients instead of 3, then once someone writes about my work instead of about somebody else's. Each time she crossed a line, she felt the brief, bright relief of arrival. And then, almost before she could enjoy it, the line had already moved again, further out, just past where she could comfortably reach. It had been moving for 16 years. She had never once caught it. 3 years earlier, a small regional magazine had run a feature on rising furniture makers, the kind of glossy 2-page spread that could fill an order book for a year. Elena had trained for one winter alongside another of Soren's old students, a quiet, talented man named Petar, before the two of them had gone their separate ways to build their own shops. When the magazine came out, it was Petar's work table photographed under careful lighting. Petar's name in the pull quote. Petar's hands shone mid-cut on the cover. Elena bought a copy anyway, told herself she was happy for him, and then spent the better part of that month quietly convinced that whatever Petar had, she was still missing. It didn't occur to her until much later that the two of them had never actually been in any kind of race. She had simply decided, without ever asking him, that his shelf and her shelf were standing on the same wall, being measured by the same ruler. and that she had lost. Her apprentice, Theo, arrived a little after 7, dropping his bag by the door, with the particular cheerfulness of a 23-year-old who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of his own ambition. "You're already up," he said, eyeing the board on the bench. "Let me guess, the Whitfield table again." "It's not right yet." "It was right 3 days ago." "It's close," Elena said, which both of them understood to mean not yet, and which neither of them questioned, because this was simply how Elena worked and had always worked, and Theo privately suspected, though he would never have said it out loud, would always work unless something changed. Word came that afternoon that Marcus Hale wanted to see her. Marcus had sold his shipping company 2 years earlier for a sum large enough that the local papers had run his photograph beside the number, as though the number were the actual story and Marcus were only there to hold it. He wanted a desk, he explained. Something heavy and unhurried, something his grandchildren could put their hands on, long after his name meant nothing to anyone at all. He walked the showroom slowly, hands in his pockets, nodding at things he clearly wasn't really looking at. "You know," he said eventually, more to the window than to her, "I used to think the day I sold that company something would lift. Some weight I'd been carrying since I was younger than you, I'd hit the number. The number I always told myself would finally be enough." He gave a short laugh, more breath than sound. "I woke up the next morning already thinking about the next thing. Real estate this time. It never lifts. I genuinely don't know why I kept believing it would." Elena made the polite sound people make when they've heard something true but haven't yet recognized it as a mirror held up to their own face. She took his measurements, walked him to the door, and had nearly forgotten the conversation by the time his car left the gravel. She had a board to get right. The 6 weeks narrowed fast after that. Elena worked later, ate less, said sorry to Theo more often than either of them liked. She finished a commission for a longtime client during that stretch. A simple bookshelf in pale oak, the kind of clean, honest work that had quietly built her entire reputation, and felt almost nothing handing it over. The client actually teared up a little, running her hand along the grain, saying it was exactly what she'd dreamed of for the corner of her late mother's old reading room. "I didn't think anyone could build something this honest," the woman said, pressing her palm flat against the wood, as though checking that it was real. "It feels like it's always been there." Elena thanked her, meant it for about 4 seconds, and then heard herself already running the numbers on the exhibition piece before the woman had even reached her car. 3 years earlier, a moment like that would have kept Elena warm for a week. Now she barely registered it. She had already moved on in her head to the next measurement, the next gap, before the woman had even finished saying thank you. Theo noticed. He always noticed, though he rarely said so out loud. One evening, watching her stare past her dinner at the half-finished showpiece across the room rather than eat it, he asked carefully, "Do you ever feel like you're already disappointed in something you haven't even finished yet?" Elena didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence answered for her, and it was not a comfortable one. 4 days before the submission deadline, disaster arrived the way it usually does. Quietly, overnight, while no one was watching. Elena had rushed the drying process on the centerpiece, a cabinet built from a single, breathtaking slab of old walnut she'd been saving for nearly a decade, because there hadn't been time to let the wood settle properly, not with Voss's panel 6 weeks away instead of 6 months. She came in at dawn to find a crack running the full length of the door panel, deep and unapologetic. The kind of split that doesn't ask permission. She stood in front of it for a long time without moving. 10 years of saving the right wood for the right piece, and here it was, split open in the cold morning light. and something in her own chest split open right along with it. This is what I actually am, she thought, watching the crack as though it might still close if she stared at it hard enough. Not someone who is almost there. Someone who isn't enough and was never going to be no matter what she built on top of the not enough. She didn't go near the hall for 2 days. She didn't call Voss's office to withdraw, though the thought crossed her mind more than once, usually around 3 in the morning. Instead, on the second night, she drove out past the edge of town to the small orchard where her old teacher, Soren, had retired 6 years earlier. Because some part of her, the part that hadn't yet learned the new arithmetic she was about to learn, still half believed he might fix what was broken, even though she knew, walking up the dark gravel path, that he couldn't fix wood anymore. His hands had stopped being steady enough for that years ago. Soren had retired from the bench 6 years earlier, not entirely by choice. A fine, persistent tremor had crept into his right hand sometime in his 60s and had simply never left. He'd bought the orchard instead, a few acres of old apple trees an hour outside town, and seemed, as far as Elena could tell from her occasional visits, entirely unbothered by the trade. He grew things that didn't require steady hands. He read in the evenings. And in the corner of his small sitting room, he kept a handful of objects from his old life. A few tools he no longer used. A single chair he'd never been able to bring himself to sell. And the cross-section of oak that Elena had once sanded so unevenly, she'd nearly thrown it in his stove rather than let him see it. "I remember hating it," she said. "I remember it being the first thing you ever finished," Soren said. He turned it slowly in the lamplight, and the rings caught the glow. One inside the next, inside the next. Decades of drought and rain and ordinary good years, pressed flat into the grain. "A tree never measures itself against the tallest tree in the forest," he said quietly, almost to the wood rather than to her. "It only adds what it adds. 1 ring a year. It doesn't know any other way to grow, and it never once stops to wonder if the ring it just finished was good enough." Elena looked at the rings, narrow and tight where the years had been hard, wide and easy where they hadn't, and noticed that every single one of them was still there, still part of the trunk, none of them erased or undone by whatever came after. Soren turned the slice once more in his weathered hands and asked her the only question he'd brought her out here all those years ago to eventually learn how to ask gently. "When you look at everything you've built since that first ugly piece of wood," he said, "are you counting how far you still have to go? Or are you counting how far you've already come?" It wasn't really a question that belonged only to her. It was the kind of question that, once asked in a quiet room late at night, has a way of turning slowly toward whoever happens to be listening. Elena didn't answer him that night. She didn't have an answer yet. But she carried the question home wrapped carefully, the way you carry a coal you don't want to go out before you found a use for it. She didn't fix the cabinet that week. She let it sit, cracked, in the corner of the workshop. And instead, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she sat down at the small desk by the window with a blank notebook and tried something that felt, at first, almost embarrassingly simple. She tried just once imagining this exact evening if none of the last 12 years had happened at all. No workshop, no waiting list, no Theo asleep in the next room, only the cold garage and the second-hand saw, and a future that hadn't been built yet. She sat with that empty version of her life for a full minute, on purpose, just to feel the shape of what was actually missing from it. Then she opened her eyes to the real room around her and let herself feel briefly and almost painfully how much of it she had simply stopped seeing. She wrote down 3 things that night, not 3 things she still needed to do, but 3 things the 16-year-old version of her, sweeping floors in someone else's shop, would have found nearly impossible to believe. I own this building outright. People wait 4 months for a seat at my bench. A man who sold a company for more money than I will ever see still wanted my hands on his desk, and not someone else's. It felt strange at first, almost dishonest, like quietly cheating at a game whose entire point had always been to feel slightly behind. But she did it again the next night, and the next. Some nights the list came easily. Other nights she sat with the pen hovering for a long, irritated minute, half convinced the whole exercise was nothing more than a polite lie she was telling herself, the kind of thing that wouldn't survive contact with an actual deadline. But she kept doing it anyway, mostly out of stubbornness. The same stubbornness that had once kept her sanding a single chair leg for 6 straight hours, rather than admit defeat to a piece of pine. By the end of the second week, she noticed something she hadn't expected. She wasn't waiting for the list to feel true anymore. It simply was. She told Theo about it not long after, clumsily, in her own plain words, because she still didn't have whatever language a book or a teacher might have used for it, only the shape of the thing. I think I've been measuring everything wrong, she said. I keep comparing what I have now to some version of myself that doesn't exist yet, instead of comparing it to the version of me who used to ruin chair legs for a living. Theo, to his credit, didn't make it bigger than it needed to be. He just said, "Good. Tell me when you start doing it the old way again. I'll catch it." And from then on, more often than either of them ever announced out loud, he did exactly that, usually with nothing more than a raised eyebrow across the workshop, which was somehow enough. It didn't fix everything right away. 8 days before the exhibition, with the cabinet still unrepaired, the old fear came roaring back in full force, and she snapped at Theo over nothing. Theo, who had clearly been waiting for exactly this, simply said, "There it is," without any heat in his voice at all, and went back to his own bench, which somehow made the moment both worse and better at the same time. That night she lay awake doing the familiar arithmetic again. Once Voss sees it, once it's perfect, once, until she caught herself mid-thought and almost laughed, despite everything, at how quickly the old habit could still find its footing. Soren had warned her in his quiet way that the tree doesn't stop growing rings just because it learns what they mean. It only gets a little better, season after season, at trusting the ones it's already grown. There was an older memory Elena had never let herself look at directly, not once in 12 years. Her very first workshop, the one before this one, had failed. Not slowly, all at once within a single brutal month, when her only major client backed out and the lease came due and there was nothing left to do but close the door and carry her tools out in cardboard boxes while the landlord watched, arms crossed, from the curb. She remembered the exact sound the door made when she locked it for the last time, an ordinary click that hadn't felt ordinary at all. She remembered driving home with the back seat full of tools that suddenly looked like nothing more than tools, and calling her mother from a parking lot to say, as steadily as she could manage, that the workshop hadn't worked out, careful to use a phrase soft enough that it wouldn't crack on the way out of her mouth. For 12 years she had treated that month as proof. The one piece of evidence that underneath everything she'd built since, she was still, secretly, the person who had failed. Sitting with her notebook one night, she made herself look at it differently, almost as an experiment, the way Soren used to turn a board over to check the far face for hidden flaws before deciding whether to keep it. What had that failure actually given her? It had given her 4 unbearable empty months, with nothing to do but read everything she could find about wood and joinery and finish, because reading was free and pity was not. It had given her eventually the courage to knock on Soren's door, half ruined, and desperate enough to offer to sweep his floors for nothing, just to be near a working bench again. The failure she had spent 12 years carrying like a scar had been, all along, the actual beginning of everything she now had. She hadn't survived in spite of it. She had built directly on top of it, ring by ring, without ever once stopping to notice the wood underneath her feet. She cried for a while that night, not from sadness exactly, more from the strange relief of finally being allowed to set a heavy thing down after carrying it for so long she'd forgotten it had a weight at all. She went back to the cracked cabinet 2 days later with different eyes. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the harder decisions she'd made in years, not because the choice itself was complicated, but because the old version of her would never have trusted herself enough to make it alone. She didn't call Soren to ask if it was the right move. She didn't wait for Theo to tell her it would work. She simply decided, and then she began. The old Elena, the one who had spent a lifetime counting the gap, would have scrapped the whole slab and started again from nothing, ashamed to let anyone see the flaw. The Elena standing in the workshop that morning ran her fingers along the crack instead and saw, underneath the damage, something else entirely, a line that told the truth about what had actually happened, rather than a line that hid it. She didn't sand it smooth and disguise it. She filled the crack with a thin, bright inlay of pale maple, the kind of repair that doesn't pretend the wood was never broken, only shows plainly and without apology that it was broken once and is whole again anyway. She worked slowly, fitting each sliver of pale wood by hand, sanding the seam level rather than sanding it away, until the repair sat inside the dark walnut like a single bright vein of light rather than a wound. It took her 3 more days, working calmer than she had in months, and it was, by every honest measure she now knew how to take, the bravest piece of work she had made in years, not because it came out flawless, but because she finally let it be seen exactly as it was. The Centennial Exhibition opened on a bright, ordinary morning, the hall full of polished, careful work and the low murmur of makers trying very hard to look unbothered. She recognized a few faces from years of regional shows, a woman who built spare, severe chairs that always seemed to win something, and a pair of brothers known for elaborate marquetry that made Elena's own work look almost plain by comparison. For one bad minute, standing among them, she felt the old arithmetic try to start up again, counting every way her cabinet fell short of theirs. She thought of Soren's slice of oak, sitting back home on her own windowsill now, and made herself stop counting forward. She reminded herself deliberately that the woman beside the severe chairs had been building for 30 years, and Elena had been building for 12, and that this, on its own terms, measured against nothing but her own beginning, was already something worth standing inside of. Elena stood beside her cabinet, listening to her own pulse louder than the conversation around her, when Anton Voss arrived at her station a little past midday. An older man in a plain gray coat, exactly as unremarkable in person as every photograph had somehow failed to suggest, who looked at things for a long, unhurried time before he said anything at all. He looked at the maple seam running down the door panel for longer than Elena expected. "This was a flaw," he said finally, "not a question." "It was," Elena said. "I rushed the drying. It cracked 4 days before the deadline." She had practiced a dozen versions of this answer in her head over the past week, most of them apologetic, building towards some kind of excuse. The one that actually came out of her mouth instead was simply true. Voss nodded slowly, still studying the seam rather than her. Most people would have hidden it, or thrown the slab out and started again. I didn't think I could afford to pretend it never happened, Elena said. So I decided to make it part of the truth of the piece instead of something to be ashamed of. He said something brief and professional after that, the kind of remark a judge offers a dozen makers in a single afternoon, and moved on to the next station. And that, in the end, was all that happened. No dramatic prize, no public anointing, nothing that would have made for a satisfying ending if the ending had depended on him saying more. The strange thing Elena noticed, standing alone again beside her cabinet in the bright, ordinary noise of the hall, was that she had already stopped waiting for it to matter. Somewhere underneath that short exchange, without her quite catching the exact moment it happened, the old arithmetic had finally gone quiet. She didn't need his nod to know what 12 years, one failed workshop, one patient teacher, one cracked slab of walnut, and several thousand small, invisible decisions had actually built. She already knew. She had been writing it down, 3 lines a night, for weeks. Marcus Hale came by the workshop himself a few days later to collect his desk, running his palms slowly over the grain the way people do when they're not sure what they're allowed to feel about furniture. "You seem different," he said, almost as an afterthought, halfway out the door. "I've been keeping a kind of record," Elena said, "of what I've actually built instead of what I still don't have." She hadn't meant to say it. It came out anyway, plain and unpolished, the way most true things do. Marcus stood there a moment with his hand still on the desk. "I might try that," he said. And for the first time since she had met him, he didn't sound like a man already halfway gone to the next number. She drove home past dark that night, the way she had so many nights before, except this time she didn't replay the day looking for the place she'd fallen short. She thought instead about the desk now sitting in Marcus's study, waiting for grandchildren who hadn't been born yet, and felt something close to tenderness toward the whole strange, uneven shape of the last 12 years. Theo had left a lamp on for her in the workshop, the way he always did now without being asked. She walked past the empty corner where the cracked cabinet used to sit and picked up a fresh board for tomorrow's work, running her thumb along its edge out of the old habit, feeling for a flaw that may or may not be there. This time, underneath the searching, a different and quieter understanding was waiting. The kind that doesn't need to raise its voice to be true. It had been enough all along, she thought. All of it. Every uneven ring, every rushed and rescued board, every month she'd once been ashamed of. The only thing that had ever actually needed to change was how she counted it. She set the board down, turned off the lamp, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, went home without measuring anything else that night. Tomorrow there would be a new board, and almost certainly a new flaw to search for, and probably a new ideal waiting somewhere just out of reach, because that, she now understood, was simply what it meant to keep building anything worth building. The line would likely keep moving, the way it always had. She had simply stopped mistaking the moving line for the truth of how far she'd already come.